Welcome to Section 2, Building a Typical Web API. In this section, we will dive deeper by building a RESTful contact API that will allow us to implement REST best practices. Now that you are familiar with basic REST API practices from previous section, it's time to go deeper. We will first see how to specify the operations exposed by our contact API, then implement the corresponding routes. We will next query our API using mock data, then you will have a look at content negotiation, and finally we will version our contact API. So let's start with specifying the API. On this table, you can see the different operations performed by our API. These operations are translated by the endpoints of the API. According to the REST principles, an operation is exposed by an HTTP method and a URI, which stands for Uniform Resource Identifier. This URI represents a resource, in our case, contacts and groups. Think of endpoints as ways to manipulate the state of a resource, that is, creation, read, update, etc. The action performed by each operation should not contradict the natural meaning of its HTTP method. So now, let's set up the API. Back into your code editor, you can create a new project. Inside this project, create API folder. Inside this folder, generate a server using the bash script that we created in previous section. Next, go to your server.js file. Inside the main method, we will bootstrap our server. Here, you can see that we use a server config class and pass it a configuration object to set the port, the middleware, and the routers. And then we use the listen method to start the server. Let's have a look at this server configuration in the config folder. So basically, it is a class. Inside this class, we set a private property named user accounts. By the way, this is how you set private properties in native JavaScript using the hash symbol followed by the name of the variable. This object corresponds to the users allowed to authenticate on our API. Next, in the constructor, we destructure the object that we passed to configure the server. We next create an app property on the instance of that class, which will correspond to an Express server that we import before. Next, we set the env property on this server, which corresponds to the node_env environment property from our system. This will allow us to see if we are in development, staging, or production mode. Next, we set the port property, which will correspond to our configuration object. And then we set the different middleware which are common, that is the cores, helmet, basic auth, and JSON. Let's have a look at these methods. Inside these methods, you can see that we use the register middleware method in each of them. By the way, This is called function composition. Here, we created a register middleware function, and then we derived specific middleware methods by passing different types of middleware to this generic function. For example, the register JSON middleware, we use the register middleware and pass the JSON middleware from Express. This is a common pattern in JavaScript. Then you can see that we return this. By doing so, this will allow us to use what is called the Fluent API pattern. And this allows us to chain our method instead of using this each time when calling the different middleware methods. Next, we check if middleware were set into our configuration object, and if so, we register them. Next, we set a default route handler for GET request to the root path. This can serve as a health check endpoint. More on this later in the course. Then we check if routers were set in our configuration object, and if so, we register them. By the way, if we have a look at the register router method, here we use the use method on the Express instance and pass it the base URL with the router. Next, we register error handling middleware. As you can see here, this middleware will catch errors with status code 404 and pass it to the error handling method. Finally, we register this error handling middleware. Let's have a look at it. Here, you can see that we take advantage of Express error handling middleware logic. You should call this method last in order to be able to take advantage of the middleware chain of Express. Here, we first check to see if we are in development by getting the value of the env property on our server, and if so, we will use the this register middleware to pass the error handling middleware. You can see here that this kind of middleware is similar to normal middlewares with the request, response, and next arguments, but it has first an error property. Here we use object destructuring, but we could just do error, and this shows you the form of the error handling middleware. We then return JSON with the status code, message, and stack of this error. If we are not in development, we do not return the stack for security reasons. Finally, here we can see the listen method, which calls the listen method of our Express instance and pass it the port, and then use a callback to display the listening message. So now, let's run our server. But before doing so, if you are using Visual Studio Code, I recommend installing the types of your libraries by entering this command. By using the @types followed by the name of your library if it exists. By the way, this is the definitely typed paradigm, if we can call this like that. This will allow you to get much more information about your libraries. For example, you have all this information, and if I did not install the types libraries, I would have much less. So now let's start our server. And as you can see, our server is now listening on port 3000. You can get more information by going to this link.